Back in 2009, the Spellcaster's Command Structure deck was released in North America and contained the very first Endymion cards. The archetype has become synonymous with spell counters, becoming arguably the most successful archetype to implement the mechanic. It's seen a fair share of competitive success at the regional and even the YCS level, taking third in YCS Sydney in 2020 being the most prominent top the archetype has seen to date. However, it's never really been recognized as anything higher than a Tier 2 deck at best. In April 2019, the Order of the Spellcaster's Structure deck was released, which is what modern Endymion decks are based around. It turned the archetype into a pendulum deck focused around spell counters to special summon monsters from the hand or deck, bounce monsters on the field, and just blow up the field entirely. They have synergy with archetypes like mythical beasts, who have a similar gameplay style, and can implement other spell-heavy engines to gain card advantage like Sky Striker and Spellbooks. While the archetype has never seen the competitive successes of other pendulum decks like Pepe and Pendulum Magicians, it's still a powerful archetype, and I could see it getting further support in the future. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the entire Endymion archetype card by card, what each of their effects are, and their impact on the game as a whole. These videos take a long time to create, so if you enjoy it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel for any future videos like these. Without further ado, let's break down this archetype. I will organize the cards in the archetype in order of their release, starting off with the monster the archetype is named for, Endymion the Master Magician. He's a level 7 dark spellcaster type monster with 2700 attack and 1700 defense with the following effect. You can special summon this card from your hand or graveyard by removing 6 spell counters from a magical citadel of Endymion you control. If summoned this way, target one spell in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. Once per turn, you can discard one spell, then target one card on the field, destroy that target. This is the OG, and this wasn't very good even by 2009 standards. It never saw any competitive success, and while it's nice it has a special summoning condition, that condition wasn't always the easiest to meet. While Magical Citadel is a fantastic card, there were just not enough good cards that utilized the mechanic to make a deck viable. This was at a time when Light Sworns and Zombies were at the forefront of the meta, which could generate absurd amounts of advantage and swarm the field like nobody's business. The discard to pop ability is not very good either, considering discarding to pop was just way too much of a cost. Making you have to specifically discard spell cards is a weird design choice, considering the playstyle was meant to generate spell counters rather than pitch the cards that generate them. If you could discard any card, it would have made it marginally better, but still not very good. I could understand a little more if the effect was not a soft once per turn, but for context, Judgment Dragon was released in Light of Destruction 1 year prior to this card's release, which for just 1000 life points, you can blow up all other cards on the field. All in all, this card was never worth running, and it's still not. The next monster is Crusader of Endymion, a level 4 light spellcaster type Gemini monster with 1900 attack and 1200 defense, and after normal summoning it twice, has the following effect. Once per turn, you can target one face-up card on the field that you can place a spell counter on, place one spell counter on it, and if you do, this card gains 600 attack until the end of this turn. Geminis have essentially become a meme in the Yu-Gi-Oh community. While this effect is not entirely awful, it's held back strictly because it's a Gemini monster. Having to wait 2 turns to use this effect is really not worth the hassle by today's standards. Even if it plays 3 spell counters, no one would play it in Endymion because it's just way too slow. However, with that being said, it did see some competitive success between 2011 and 2013 in Miracle Fusion Geminis and Hero Beat decks. Regardless, today this card is pretty much useless and control-based decks have bigger and better tools at their disposal. There is no real obvious reason this was made to be a Gemini monster in the first place. This is the only one in the archetype, which tells me Konami really didn't have a solid design philosophy for Endymion cards besides spell counters. Now we move on to the field spell, which was released in the same year, Magical Citadel of Endymion. Each time a spell card is activated, place one spell counter on this card when that spell resolves. If a card with spell counters is destroyed, place its spell counters on this card. Once per turn, if you would activate a card effect by removing spell counters from a card you control, you can remove that many spell counters from this card instead. If this card would be destroyed, you can remove one spell counter from this card instead. This is a fantastic field spell. This is a spell counter storage device that has great protection at the low cost of just one spell counter, and the ability to be able to use the spell counters on this card in substitution is fantastic. You won't always have the ability to place enough spell counters on the card you want to activate, so this fills in the gap to give you excellent recovery and extend further than you normally could without it. In addition, with Mythical Institution and the Mythical Beasts, the amount of plays and recovery options that you get become borderline insane. You won't typically find this in the Pendulum Magician variant since spell counters are not as critical in the playstyle, but in more pure variants, this card is essential. Over the next 10 years, Endymion would see no new additional cards added to the archetype. That is until 2019 when the Order of the Spellcaster Structure deck hit the market and completely overhauled the archetype and turned it into what we see today. Endymion himself got a retrain and has the most amount of text ever printed on a Yu-Gi-Oh card, so let's start off with the Master Magician himself, Endymion, the mighty master of magic. deck. He's a level 7 dark spellcaster type pendulum monster, scale 8, with 2700 attack and 1700 defense with the pendulum effect. You can remove 6 spell counters from your field, special summon this card from the pendulum zone, then count the number of cards you control that can have a spell counter. Destroy up to that many cards on the field, and if you do, place spell counters on this card equal to the number of cards destroyed. You can only use this effect of Endymion, the Mighty Master of Magic, once per turn. His monster effect states, once per turn, when a spell or trap card or effect is activated, quick effect, you can return one card you control with a spell counter to the hand, and if you do, negate the activation, and if you do that, destroy it. Then you can place the same number of spell counters on this card that the return card had. While this card has a spell counter, your opponent cannot target it with card effects. Also, it cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. When this card with a spell counter is destroyed by battle, you can add one normal spell from your deck to your hand. There is so much good stuff going on this card, so let's break it down. The 6 spell counter summoning condition is actually a non-issue in this scenario because you can remove them from anywhere on the field and not just the citadel. To boot, when he is summoned, he effectively blows up anything on the field you desire and clears the path for you to run over your opponent immediately afterwards. He gives himself targeting and destruction immunity after he nukes the field, and if your opponent somehow runs him over, he searches any normal spell from the deck for you to add it to your hand. I love this card on so many levels because it shows Konami realize that spell counters themselves don't do anything, and the effects cards like these need to do to take advantage of the mechanic need to be explosive considering the investment. The retrain is absolutely fantastic, and I'm glad Konami took the direction they did by taking what made him so unplayable in his original form and turned it into something absolutely bonkers. The next monster is Reflection of Endymion, a level 7 light spellcaster type pendulum monster, scale 2 with 1850 attack and 2700 defense with the pendulum effect. Each time a spell card is activated, place one spell counter on this card when that spell resolves. You can remove 3 spell counters from this card, special summon both this card from your pendulum zone and one monster from your hand that you can place a spell counter on, and if you do, place one spell counter on each. The monster effect states, you can only special summon Reflection of Endymion once per turn. If this card is special summoned, you can target one card your opponent controls and one card you control with a spell counter, except this card, return that opponent's card, also your card, to the hand. Then place the same number of spell counters on this card that your return card had. When this card with a spell counter is destroyed by battle, you can add one Endymion card from your deck to your hand. Reflection is one of the 2 Endymion cards you would ideally like to open with because it allows you to get your combo started and monsters onto the board. Part of what makes this archetype so good is that all of the pendulum monsters summon other monsters from the hand, deck, or extra deck. The pendulum mechanic is ideal in combination with spell counters considering they also double as spell cards. They can then summon themselves along with another monster to clear the pendulum scale and increase board presence to do some pretty insane extra deck plays. Reflection's bouncing effect is incredibly powerful and helps clear the board while you're building your own while going second. You can summon another reflection with the first one and double the bounce effect. Its level plays a factor because you then can overlay it into Odd Eye's Absolute Dragon and link it off to special summon Odd Eye's Vortex Dragon. In some circumstances, Reflection can be bricky, but more often than not, I find it comfortable to run it 3. The next monster is Servant of Endymion, a level 3 wind spellcaster type pendulum monster, scale 2 with 900 attack and 1500 defense with the pendulum effect. Each time a spell card is activated, place one spell counter on this card when that spell resolves. You can remove 3 spell counters from this card, special summon both this card from your pendulum zone and one monster from your deck with 1000 or more attack that you can place a spell counter on, and if you do, place one spell counter on each. Her monster effect, you can only special summon Servant of Endymion once per turn. This card with a spell counter can attack directly. Once per opponent's turn, quick effect, you can discard one card, place one spell counter on each card you control that you can place a spell counter on. If this card in the monster zone is destroyed, you can place this card in your pendulum zone, then place the same number of spell counters on it that it had as a monster. Servant is the monster you ideally want to open with when playing the deck. She special summons any member of the archetype besides herself. Other notable targets are Mythical Beast Jackal King and Mythical Beast Master Cerberus. Altogether, this means she has access to bouncing, monster negation, spell and trap negation, and banishing. As of the recording of this video, she is still limited to 1 copy, which does reduce the power of the deck, but it certainly doesn't cripple it. I hope in the near future, Konami releases her from the ban list, as the deck has not really been doing too much at a competitive level, and give me the chance to play with 3 of my holographic waifus. Depending how you open, you typically want to prioritize her and get her in the scales as quickly as possible. She is one of the best cards in the archetype, so if she ever does come off the list, you should always run her at 3. The next monster is Magister of Endymion, a level 3 Earth spellcaster pendulum monster, scale 8 with 1500 attack and 900 defense with the pendulum effect. Each time a spell card is activated, place one spell counter on this card when that spell resolves. You can remove 3 spell counters from this card, special summon both this card from your pendulum zone and one face-up monster from the extra deck that you can place a spell counter on, and if you do, place one spell counter on each. His monster effect, you can only special summon Magister of Endymion once per turn. When this card declares an attack, you can place one spell counter on it. Once per opponent's turn, quick effect, you can remove 3 spell counters from your field, special summon one monster from your deck that you can place a spell counter on. on. If this card in your monster zone is destroyed, you can place this card in your pendulum zone, then place the same number of spell counters on it that it had as a monster. Magister to me is a little underrated, but it's understandable. While his pendulum effect is very solid, it takes a little setup to be able to summon a monster you would like to from the extra deck. It's a little difficult during the first turn of the game, however mythical beasts help to alleviate this issue. This is typically why opening with him can be a little hit or miss, but he does help extend your plays, and his on-field effect is like Servants but in the monster zone. He's a wonderful card, and I usually don't have any issues with running him at 3, but you can experiment with the ratios. Endymion, the Magister of Mastery, is a thing, but he's not really important in the context of the archetype. I haven't found a use for him in the deck itself, at least nothing spectacular to make him worth running, so if you're aware of a combo I'm not familiar with, leave it in the comments down below. One more monster came out in 2019 after the release of the structure deck in Rising Rampage, and that's Rogue of Endymion. It's a level 3 fire spellcaster type monster with 1500 attack and 200 defense with the following effect. If this card is normal or special summon, place 1 spell counter on it. You can remove 1 spell counter from this card and discard 1 spellcaster monster. Set 1 continuous spell directly from your deck, but for the rest of this turn, you cannot activate it or activate cards or effects of the card with its name. You can only use each effect of Rogue of Endymion once per turn. This was so close to being good. It's not absolutely awful, but it's slow, and it's because of the limitation on activation. Searching for any continuous spell would be a really strong effect, but the fact that you have to wait until the next turn before you can activate it makes it really difficult to even consider it as a one-of in the deck. You would rather commit resources to things you can do on the same turn rather than grab something and hope you would be able to use it on the next one. And that's it for the main deck monsters. From here we move on to the spells, starting with Spell Power Mastery. It's a normal spell with the following effect. Add 1 Endymion card from your deck to your hand, then you can count the number of Spell Power Mastery and Spell Power Grasp you control and or you have in your graveyard, and place that many spell counters among cards you control that you can place a spell counter on. You can only activate 1 Spell Power Mastery per turn. It's a searcher that places spell counters. It's as good as it gets for this archetype. Not much to say here other than that it's a 3 of in any Endymion-centric build. It sucks you can't activate it more than once, but it's essentially 4 copies of Servant in the deck. Spell Power Grasp, by contrast, is similar but only adds another copy of itself from the deck. The problem here is that it doesn't really do anything on its own. This is typically why you won't find too many deck lists that run this. It's just cloggy and doesn't do enough to support the plays the deck wants to make. It's better that spell counters you accrue come passively from more proactive spell cards rather than just a dedicated spell card that dishes out spell counters. The last spell is Endymion's Lab, a continuous spell with the following effect. This card's name becomes Magical Citadel of Endymion while in the spell and trap zone. Each time a spell card is activated, place 1 spell counter on this card when that spell resolves. Once per turn, after damage calculation, if your spellcaster monster is destroyed by battle, you can remove 6 spell counters from your field. Special summon 1 level 7 or higher spellcaster monster from your hand or deck. You can only activate 1 Endymion's Lab per turn. It's not great. There's a few issues here, so let's break it down. Unlike Magical Citadel, this card has no protection and doesn't actively support the plays your other spell counter-centric cards are trying to make. The effect only triggers when a spellcaster is destroyed by battle and nothing else. Mythical Institution, by contrast, will net you a search for a monster, and you can use spell counters from anywhere on the field and not have to wait for your monsters to get run over to do it. I can see what they were going for, but it's just too restrictive to make it worth running, and despite the fact that it's searchable, there are much better targets in the archetype that you would rather have. And that's it for all the main deck cards. Now we have one extra deck monster to speak of, Selene, Queen of the Master Magicians. She's a Link 3 light spellcaster type monster with a bottom left, down, and bottom right arrows with 1850 attack, requires 2+ monsters, including a spellcaster, with the following effect. If this card is Link Summon, place spell counters on this card equal to the number of spells on the field and in the graveyards. While an Endymion card or cards is on the field, your opponent cannot target this card for attacks. Once per turn during the main phase, quick effect, you can remove 3 spell counters from your field, special summon 1 spellcaster monster from your hand or graveyard in defense position to your zone this card points to. Selene is amazing. Her battle protection comes up surprisingly often. She can revive any spellcaster type monster from the graveyard or special summon them from the hand. It's an easy way to get Master Cerberus onto the field from your hand, or if you used Instant Fusion, you can revive Millennium Eyes or Thousand Eyes Restrict. She's a logical link climb for the deck and helps to extend your plays if you're looking to go into Appaloosa. She's an absolute staple, and I typically like to run her at 2 for the grind game. The Endymion archetype overall was handled very well. It started off with very few spell counter based cards, but evolved into one of my absolute favorite archetypes. So far, it's generally been unaffected by power creep and handles just as well as when the deck in its current form came out. It still has power to gain, with Servant still being on the limited list, but I would like to see new additions added to the archetype in the future. The extra deck feels a bit sparse, with Selene being the only true dedicated card, and some new spell cards that plays into the spell counter-oriented playstyle wouldn't hurt. If you have never played a Pendulum deck before, I would say this is probably one of the best ones to get started with. This deck was responsible for my love of Pendulums today, and that's why I still main this deck. During the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, spell counters were around but never fully realized, and it was something I was hoping Konami would utilize in the future. They finally did, and made something pretty amazing out of it. If there's an archetype that you would like to see me break down, leave it in the comments down below, and who knows, you might just get your wish. Thanks for watching.